This video explores race and racism in Lord of the Flies. As such, it quotes from the novel, and one quotation includes a deeply offensive racial slur. I felt its inclusion was important as part of wider discussions about depictions of race in the novel. This video critiques and explores race and the colonial imagination that underpins the book. Outside of this specific context, I completely reject and condemn such language. Hi everyone, it's Mr. Boff here. In today's video, I'm going to be examining the relationship between William Golding's Lord of the Flies and colonialism and race. And it feels a particularly apposite moment to do that, given the broader cultural discussion, social discussion about Black Lives Matter, Britain's imperial and colonial past, racism in this country. These are really live issues, understandably, and I'm sure you've noticed that in the news. And so I think this feels like a really good time to re-examine Lord of the Flies. Okay, now the title of this particular video, Savages in the Forest, actually comes from an essay by Stephen Hawling, a literary critic, who writes, I'll give the link to that in a moment, who's written what I found a very stimulating, challenging and persuasive essay called The Savages in the Forest, Decolonising William Golding. And so that essay, Hawling's essay, is really the stimulus in many ways for this particular video. Hawling's essay, which I'll come to in a moment, is taken from a broader collection of essays, and I'll point out why some of those other essays might be worth reading shortly. So we're going to look at that text where this essay is taken from. We're going to look at Hawling's contention that Lord of the Flies has a profoundly conservative ethos, which might come as a surprise perhaps to some readers. We're going to take a close look at the word savage, the etymology and history of that word, given how many times it actually crops up over the course of the novel Lord of the Flies. And then we're going to examine a couple of key quotations. Those quotations are also examined in Hawling's essay. So, I read the essay as part of a broader collection of academic essays examining Lord of the Flies, edited by Harold Bloom. I'd strongly recommend the whole text. It's well worth reading. Some really interesting thinking going on in this book. But I want to focus on this specific one here, and this notion of decolonising William Golding, to re-examine Lord of the Flies and consider how the novel is very much a product of a specific set of historical circumstances. I think when Lord of the Flies is taught, and indeed many readers come to this view, and in fact William Golding even, I think, suggests that this is true of his own novel. There's this idea that Lord of the Flies is somehow a kind of universal statement that, you know, man's inhumanity to man, that evil, that being beneath the sort of veneer or facade of civilization there lurks evil in indeed all of us, that there's this human propensity to descend into evil. That those might seem on the face of it universal themes, but at the same time the way in which these ideas are explored in the novel are extremely historically determined, I would say. And I think that that's what Hawling does so well in his essay, is examine the broader context in which Golding was writing, and indeed where some of these imaginative kind of constructions come from. You realise that they are very much of their time. So let's consider this opening quotation from the actual essay, that Lord of the Flies reflects a profoundly conservative ethos. Now, broadly speaking, there are probably about three ways in which Hawling kind of argues this. The first is that Golding presents in the novel itself an empire-orientated view. What do we mean by that? We mean that there is a Eurocentrism in the misrepresentation of white boys, civilized, in inverted commas, white boys descending into a kind of black or African barbarity. We'll talk a little bit more specifically about this. There is, therefore, building on that point, a notion throughout the novel that whiteness descends into a seeming savage blackness, and part of that can be typified by this quotation when Piggy's challenging the boys. What are we, humans or animals? Or there's this other category altogether, perhaps neither human nor animal, the savage. Okay, and we might see that sense of whiteness into blackness as articulating a kind of anxiety in Britain at the time about the role of Britain in the world, and importantly Britain's relationship with its rapidly disintegrating empire post the Second World War. And building on that, the role of body painting and masks, these symbolise a fall or descent from civilization into savagery. And that's very interesting that Golding chooses to use body painting and the wearing of masks by the boys as a sort of proxy for savagery and barbarity. And there's a rather interesting stark contrast between the boys at the end of the novel, where they've sort of fully descended, with the exception of Ralph, painted, mask wearing and so on, and the neatly turned out naval officer. So what seems to be clear in the novel is that Golding, in attempting to articulate this tussle, seemingly eternal tussle between civilization and savagery, he opts for a particularly Eurocentric kind of colonialist way of articulating that particular tussle or fight between these two ideas. So let's look at this word savage. Savage and savages, these two words come up time and time again throughout the course of the novel, and it's very, very interesting looking at the etymology of this particular word. So we can see the connection between this word and animals. Okay, this notion of not being fully human, I think, is very, very important, becoming animalistic. But also, if you have a look at its origins from Latin, as it says here, of the woods, literally of the woods, coming from woods, or indeed in our case in the novel, the jungle, there is this connection between the word savage and deeply problematic racist notions of blackness, and the connection between blackness, living in jungle or forests, and behaving in animalistic ways. So I think the word savage and the idea of savages is very, very much of this particular historical moment. And it's interesting in the novel that Golding reaches for this term, reaches for this kind of lexis, and embeds that so profoundly within the structures of the novel itself. Let's have a look then at some of the key quotations from the book. So we've got this one here. Okay, now this is one of the most troubling moments in the novel. We've obviously got a particular term that is so inextricably bound up with violence and racism and oppression, and it's so interesting that Piggy's using it. At the same time, I'm not entirely convinced that there's a sort of neat distancing going on here, that Golding is as sort of far away from this viewpoint as we perhaps might wish to imagine. That there is this contrast between the boys who've descended into savagery, a kind of, in inverted commas, black savagery, and the still generally sensible, white, upstanding Ralph, who we note has not painted his face, has not descended into wearing masks and so on. Notice too that the shell, this kind of beacon of glowing whiteness, is fragile, ultimately shattered by these marauding savages. Okay, that white civilization itself is incredibly fragile and vulnerable to this awful, seemingly awful pack of savages. if we have a look at another important quotation, we can see how Golding draws depictions of the boys. This is right at the end of the book. Draws depictions of the boys from contemporary depictions of what we might, in inverted commas, tribes people. Look at this final line here. Tiny tots, some of them brown. So notice the importance of that word there and what that word is doing and potentially conveying, and the distended bellies of small savages, playing on that trope that will be very, very familiar to Golding and his readership of the distended bellies of small savages. It's a white Eurocentric depiction of black otherness, that these are somehow not fully human, they're not like us, they're strange, exotic, odd, and even more troubling, I suppose, for the novel, that the boys themselves have kind of turned into, these white English boys have turned into, shock horror, have turned into brown, small savages with distended bellies. So you've got this deeply racialized language, and this is the novel drawing on tropes which were prevalent in the society, in Golding society at the time. When the boys descend from civilization into savagery, what imaginative apparatus does Golding reach for? He reaches for this hyper-racialized language, which is worth thinking about, worth considering. And so what does this mean then for our study of Lord of the Flies? We need to understand a crucial number of things, okay? The first thing we need to understand is that there's this, we need an awareness of empire. We need to understand that after the Second World War, Britain's empire was crumbling, okay? And there were real anxieties about that process, that the formerly colonized peoples around all over the world were demanding control of their own societies. And there's a kind of anxiety about that process going on in the novel, that whiteness is almost under threat from overseas. And so Golding draws on that sense of anxiety in this book. Notice too that Golding is operating within a kind of colonial imagination. So these depictions of savages are drawn from this racist colonial imagination. That the boys, when they descend from seeming civilization into savagery, they turn into a kind of stereotypical tribe depiction that was extremely prevalent throughout Western societies in their understanding and treatment of African cultures. And there is a kind of ignorance of African cultures in this particular novel. And in fact, even in interviews, Golding attests to his own ignorance of Chinese history, history of different African peoples and so on. He recognises he doesn't really understand that, and so reaches for these particular racist tropes. Which links on to the next point, whiteness and blackness. There's this connection between civilization and whiteness, and blackness and savagery. The boys, they're brown by the end of the novel. They're painting their faces. They're doing all of these kind of symbolic activities that in the sort of racist imagination of the time were deeply connected with barbaric African tribes. There's no attempt to understand, of course, that painting faces, wearing masks and so on are as symbolic as the naval officer wearing his smart outfit with epaulets, that they are all kind of symbolic articulations of meaning within wider cultures. In this novel, painting one's face, wearing masks are kind of torn out of any kind of contextualization within some African society, and simply are expressions, pretty straightforward expressions of savagery, and indeed even worse than that, expressions of evil. So what does this mean? Does this mean that Lord of the Flies is a terrible book? Well, no. It's a rich novel. It's still very important to read and to understand it, but I do think it's important also to challenge the book, to in a way almost read it against the grain, to consider the novel in ways that perhaps we've not considered it previously, recognizing that this novel, which seems to have a kind of structure of a fable, of that has something very profound to say about our moral character as a species, is perhaps not quite so universal as Golding and indeed the novel itself might wish to present itself. But in fact, it is a book really indelibly, deeply marked by attitudes of the time. And given that we're here in 2020 thinking about, or should be thinking about, our past, I think it's very, very important, therefore, to reconsider Lord of the Flies in light of that past. Anyway, I hope that this has given you a little bit of food for thought, lots of different things to be considering. I'm going to attach alongside this a link so that you can actually have a read of the original essay, which I strongly recommend. Thanks for watching.